put this on and set it over here. However, my Friday night class that already did this section, the camera was too busy uploading the first section, so it didn't have.
This is interesting. It's lavender, lemon, and blueberry.
You're eating lavender?
Yeah.
That's a weird thing.
I told them to surprise me.
That would really surprise me. It's like, oh, you put soap in my
Surprise!
drink.
You put soap in your food.
Thank you.
That would be a
So,
surprise.
let me get
Does it
started
taste
on
like lavender?
Søren Kierkegaard
Sorry.
and existentialism in general.
No.
We haven't
Just
talked
put a
about
type on
Søren.
there.
I should say Søren.
No, you're not.
But if we take a look at
A month and a half.
so, some interesting things that I find interesting anyway. Kierkegaard, literally in Danish, is churchyard. Kirk is church. Gard is yard. And that actually, from what I understand, means cemetery. And the reason that his family was named Cemetery is because their house, they were given, because they were poor at the time, so the family had been given a house that was in this cemetery. So their name somehow represents that they're the folks that live in the cemetery.
Wait, they have houses on cemeteries? Like golf houses?
I don't know. You know, it'd be interesting to, I got the impression it was just
Just
the
a
only
crypt.
one. The only one that was in the cemetery.
The architect got lost.
I don't know why it
Was
was
it just
there.
a crypt that nobody was?
No, it was actually a house. A fairly large house, actually. It's a large family, actually. And confusing, because the first wife died and he married the maid. Not Søren, but his father. Also, the father was convinced that his family was cursed. And the reason for it was that he had somehow brought this on himself. And the one
They
likely...
lived in a cemetery.
No, it was when he was a kid. Apparently, he was so angry at his situation that he cursed God, and then felt that God basically got even with him by cursing his family. And the curse meant, as he interpreted it, that all of his children would die young, and they did. In the sense that, well, Kierkegaard himself was 42 when he died. Kierkegaard also fell from a tree when he was a kid. Climbing a tree, fell, hurt his back, and so he was in pain and limping the rest of his life because of that injury. So that's so another interesting issue, and this comes from a favorite author of mine, not just because she has the same name,
William?
K. Redfield Jamison, who is a psychiatrist. I've read at least 3 or 4 of her books. I can't remember. Well, the one was An Unquiet Life, and that was like her biography. An Unquiet Mind, sorry. Unquiet Mind. And that was about her, mostly from her college days, when she began realizing she was having problems. She had a mania followed by a depression, etc. So she's bipolar. And in graduate school, where she was studying psychiatry, it was colleagues that basically saved her life because she was almost dying from it at that point. But they kept her going. She graduated. She's now got plenty of interesting new medicines to use to keep that from affecting her. I know she complains that She loves the mania but hates the depression, but if you take the medicine to get rid of the depression, it also ruins your manias. A mania, that's when you're manic, so it's manic depressive. A mania is when you're like just so full of energy and everything that you're just top of the world, doing everything. But then when that period ends, then you're like, you can barely get off the ground.
I can sure crash.
Yeah, and it gets worse. Both get worse as you get older, and it seems to affect people starting around your age, around college. So it's kind of an interesting. So manic depressive illness, and notice that one of her other books is Touched by Fire. She's referring, of course, to the manic depressive illness as the fire, and she looks historically back at certain individuals, one of whom is William James. I might have mentioned her when I mentioned James, and another is Søren Kierkegaard. So his behaviors, his difficulties, in retrospect, look to her like the same thing that she had. So she figures he's probably had avant la lettre, which is a weird French expression that means before the letter, before bipolarity was named, right? Had it, right? By the way, that also leads to suicide for a lot of people. Night Falls Fast is her book about that experience. Night being, of course, the feeling that you ought to kill yourself and how fast it falls all of a sudden. You'd be absolutely happy. Kierkegaard himself, by the way, goes to a party where he's the hit of the party. And he comes home, and in this journal he says, and you feel like shooting yourself, because they had pistols by then. So there's an association with suicide for people that have it. But also exuberance, the passion for life, that goes with the mania. So she has a book on that. I haven't read Nothing Was the Same, nor Setting the River on Fire. Haven't read those, but she's quite impressive. By the way, she also does lectures that are recorded often on YouTube. So if you look up A. Redfield, you look up videos, there's tons of those if you're interested. This one's just April. Let's see this one.
Depression is very, very common. We tell our medical students at Johns Hopkins,
Well, that's a really
look,
terrible.
when I reaped a bitter harvest from this refusal to take lithium on a consistent basis. A, are they more likely to continue taking their medications? And B, is there long-term adjustment?
So you get the idea.
The state. I could see that the officer had his hand on his gun as he got out of the car. "What in the hell are you doing, running around the parking lot at this hour?" he asked. A not unreasonable question. My few remaining islets of judgment reached out to one another and linked up long enough to conclude that this particular situation was going to be hard to explain. My colleague, fortunately, was thinking far better than I was, and managed to reach down into some deeply intuitive part of his own and the world's collective unconscious, and said, "We're both on the faculty in the psychiatry department." The policeman looked at...
You get the idea. So she's good. If you're into that kind of lecture and worried about that kind of mental difficulty, look her up. Her books are also very helpful for people that have issues. Hopefully you'll never have that, and not have associations that have that, because it's dangerous. Although it also seems to be an interesting aspect of those with artistic bents that because of it, perhaps, tend to become famous because of the workaholic periods are incredibly productive and do things that get them noted. But so Søren has all of these issues. Another one is he was Lutheran. So Denmark was a Lutheran country. If you're into comparative religion and how those various religions impact individuals. By the way, another Danish lecture that I just watched last night, actually. Bruno Latour gave a lecture at the Danish Royal Society.
Would be and would have been for a long time a full-time job. The prolificacy of our speaker is amazing, and the relentless reframing of central questions is tantalizing. The field is constantly opening up in new directions. Small wonder that he was awarded the Holberg Prize last year in 2013 for his vital contribution to the social sciences. Allow me to congratulate you after the fact. Bruno Latour has indeed been one of the most influential thinkers in the social sciences, broadly defined, since his early work on laboratory life, co-authored with Steve Woolgar and appearing in 1979. Traveling freely in the intellectual landscape between philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and science and technology studies,
if the world were a bank, they should have already bailed it out. Such is the slogan painted by Greenpeace militant in one of their recent campaigns. It says a lot about our level of intellectual corruption that we don't find such a line simply funny, but
Let me try that again.
striving to set forms.
I didn't understand it the
Today,
first time either.
what now will happen is a lecture entitled
Word
The
bank?
Effects of Capitalism,
If the World
subtly
Bank,
unsettling us already by a single surprising
World
phrase,
Bank,
the A in
of the-
effects.
Yeah.
We shall
Let's see.
now hear about the place of economics and anthropology and sense how a new collective emerges
So this
in the
is someone
process of thinking.
criticizing
Please welcome Bruno Latour.
the World Bank, I believe.
if the world were a bank, they should have already bailed it out.
The World
Such is
Bank.
the slogan painted by Greenpeace militant in one of their
That's
recent
not what
campaigns.
he said.
It says a lot about our level of intellectual corruption that we don't find such a line simply funny,
The World Bank,
but tragically realistic. It has the same bleak degree of
we've
realism
already bailed
as
it out.
Frederick Jameson's famous quip that nowadays it seems easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. If you call the world, I mean the one we live in, first nature, and capitalism our second nature,
So
in the sense
same nature
of
there.
what to which we are fully habituated and which
I
is
thought
fully
Nietzsche initially,
naturalized,
but nature is what-
then what those sentences are saying is that second nature is more solid,
Second
less
nature.
transitory, less perishable than the first. No wonder the transcendent word of beyond has always been more durable than the poor word of below. But what is new is that this word of beyond is not that of salvation
The
and
world of
eternity,
beyond.
but that of economic matters. As Karl Marx would have said, the realm of transcendent has been fully appropriated by banks. Through an unexpected turn of phrase, the word of economy, far from representing a sturdy, down-to-earth materialism, a sound appetite for worldly goods and solid matters of fact,
Yes.
is now final and absolute.
And of course,
How
if you're French
mistaken
and
we
you're
were.
speaking in Denmark, you speak in
Apparently,
English.
it's the law of capitalism that Jesus had in mind when he warned his
Speak
disciples,
English everywhere you go.
heaven and earth will pass away,
D'accord.
but my
I mean,
word
yes,
will never
I agree.
pass away. This inversion of what is transitory and what is eternal is no longer a joke, especially since what we should be called the Australian strategy of voluntarily sleepwalking toward catastrophe is being implemented to the full after the last election. No content to dismantle the institution, scientific establishment, an instrument that could prepare its constituency to meet the new global threat of climate mutation. The Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, is also dismantling one after the other most Department of Social Sciences and Humanities. Well, such a strategy makes a lot of sense. Not thinking ahead is probably, when you are an Australian, given what is coming, the most rational thing to do. Not thinking seems to be the slogan of the day. When you consider that in the United States alone, according to The Guardian, something like $1 billion is being spent to generate ignorance about the anthropic origin of climate mutation. In earlier periods, scientists and intellectuals lamented the little money spent on learning, but never have we to witness floods of money spent on unlearning what was already known. While in time past thinking critically was associated with looking ahead and extracting oneself from an obscurantist past, today money is being spent to become even more obscurantist than yesterday. Agnotology, Robert Proctor's science of generating ignorance, has
Study
become
of
the most
ignorance.
important discipline of the day. And it's thanks to this great new science that so many people are able to say in the heart, perish the
Agnosticism,
word
not
provided
knowing.
by text.
Agnotology, the study of ignorance.
It is a desperate task to continue thinking when the powers of intelligence
So
are
are
dedicated to such,
Media,
to shut down thought.
I guess arguably
And to
President Trump,
march
at least
ahead.
from his point of view, he's arguing that
What is
the
there
more ignorant
in
he
this
keeps
stubborn nature
everybody, the more
that
power
generates
he'll
such
have over
lack of sensitivity to the worldly condition of our existence? That's the point I propose we tackle today. I will take capitalism to mean not a thing in the world, but a certain way of being affected when trying to think through the strange mixtures of miseries and luxuries we encounter where trying to come to terms with the dizzying interplays of goods and bads. Capitalism is a concept that has been invented to help absorbing this odd mixture of enthusiasm for the cornucopia of riches that lift billions of people out of abject poverty, with the indignation, rage, and fury for the misery visited on billions of people.
So, just introducing Bruno Latour. If you look him up, he's really kind of got an interesting approach to things. So this is a webpage of his, I guess. What strikes me as interesting is that he has a website that's a project which is already closed, but I just voted yesterday, so it's still open for you to vote and add your data. And he's just asking questions about how digitally aware you are. So that's kind of interesting. So I don't know where that project goes, but the book is titled Modes of Existence. And that's the book. And what he's talking about are what Wittgenstein called language games, I believe, or pretty kind of maybe the modern version of language games. So the modes of existence are modes, I would say, of the way we talk about the world, vocabularies. So modes as in kind of the various models of the world that in a sense form the basis of the way we view the world as individuals. So we're living within a model of the world basically that enables us to conceive of our meta-narratives, our lives, our values, and they're in conflict. And so it's a way of more scientifically analyzing these modes by getting data from as many people as possible about the way they conceive of the world, their vocabulary, see how that. So he's, in a sense, he's creating big data, I think, about the ways we perceive the world today to do a more scientific analysis of those, rather than just talking about them as being interesting and out there. He's actually trying to study just how much of these views are out there through the new tool of the internet. So he's interrogating the connections between nature and culture, if not modern, yes, what have we been, etc. So, but let me go back to Kierkegaard, because this is a Danish philosopher. I'm not sure how many other Danish philosophers there have been. I know, of course, there's some physicists. Niels Bohr was Danish, right? Am I right? Yes? Anybody know? Niels Bohr? Not familiar with Niels Bohr.
Partial physicist.
Danish. So, but I can't think of any other Danes that I can think of that any of them strike you as. Hans Christian Andersen was a Dane. You've probably read some of his stories, yes? But, and I've never been to Denmark except with my Oculus Rift, which convinced me, by the way, that Denmark is one of the most boring looking countries there is. My guess was it's somewhat similar to New Jersey in the most boring New Jersey parts. I don't know, because I've been to New Jersey, I've driven New Jersey a lot. I know the various forests are, if you've ever driven north of Denali Park and headed towards Fairbanks, there's a section there that strikes me as a lot like New Jersey, where the woods are just flat, miles, and very impoverished looking trees, you know. But, so, by the way, though, they say that Denmark is one of the happiest countries. Have you heard that?
I was just reading that.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know how the heck they measure that.
No, they're big on family life and stuff there. So.
Yeah.
Maybe they measure it based on things like time spent with family and income and stuff.
Well, I think the typical sociological way of doing a study on that is to ask people questions. Are you happy?
Yeah.
Etc. Which, to me, that would be really difficult to measure accurately because of, number one, you're asking someone a question, and who are they really to judge if they're happy or not? Well, of course, they would be, but we wouldn't. That would be a subjective point of view, not an objective point of view. But in any case, I think of Søren as very unhappy. Could, of course, be from the bipolar problem. It could be from being Lutheran. Sorry about that. But if you've read Prairie Home Companion and or listened to the radio show, right, with Garrison Keillor, you know that he makes fun of Lutherans all the time. Yes? No. Well, that's interesting. I'm not sure. Are we allowed to use him anymore as a resource? Because of course he's also now one of those Me Too targets for having apparently harassed women in his show.
I came in through the garage, and the purifier kicked.
And now, Federated Fuel Oil Dealers of Western Minnesota brings you The Secret Life of Lutherans. Marlis, listen,
Yes.
I know you may not have had this in mind when you invited me over for coffee cake and coffee, but I have to say that I've been crazy about you for years. I know it's wrong, you and I both married to wonderful people, but I want to throw it all over and run away with you and live a passionate life. Just no matter what the price we have to pay, the shame, the pain we cause to others. I can't live without you. Can't you see that somehow? I believe that you've had the same thoughts, Marlis. I'm not asking for an answer now, but you have my cell phone number, and when you say the word, I'll be here, okay?
Well, you want to run away where?
I want to give up everything I have, Marlis, my family, my career, my reputation, and take you to Italy and live with passionate abandon and delight you in every way I possibly can, stopping at nothing, a life that would be impossible for us here in Minnesota, especially this time of year. Sleep late and make love over and over and over and over and have lunch on a piazza and wine and dance and sing, just all of it. I want to give you all of it, Marlis, all of it.
Well, where exactly in Italy are you thinking about running away to?
I want to give up my family, my life, my dreams, my career. Take you to Rome and just live passionately and be free in ways we've never known. And take you to heights of ecstasy you never dreamed possible in this life, Marlis.
You know, I read somewhere that Rome is really incredibly expensive.
Marlis, I want to fly you to Rome and take you to a hotel, live without passion, live with passion, and without money, and not thinking about money, just thinking about freedom, just the freedom to feel, to love, to express the longing that I've always felt, just experience joy, and experience life in a way that's impossible here. Just take you to heights you never dreamed
This is
possible
supposed to be
in this
fun,
life, Marlis.
but in a
And
Lutheran
what do we
sort
do
of way.
then?
You mean after I take you to heights you never dreamed possible?
Yes, What do we do after that?
We have lunch, we eat, we talk, we laugh, we cry, we share, we dance, we take life in our two hands, we squeeze the juice out of it, we say how we truly feel and not how we think we're expected to feel. We rise to heights of ecstasy, as I mentioned, that we never dreamed possible in this life. We laugh, we shriek, we shout, we cry, we just...
And who picks up afterward?
Picks up what, Marlis?
Well, you know, like the empty wine bottles and the clothes you rip off of me and the bed sheets strewn all over the room.
The maid will do that.
Oh,
She'll listen to our passion until our passion is spent, and while we shower and eat and rest for the next round, she'll clean the room. So.
And she'll do the laundry?
She will, yes. The clothes that I rip off you in a frenzy of mindless desires that I can take you to heights of ecstasy, she will... What's wrong? Why do you look at me like that?
Well, wouldn't it be possible to just remove my clothes and hang them in the closet? Or, you know, even drape them lightly on a chair?
But I'm talking about a wild, irresistible frenzy of animal desire.
Right. And take me to heights of ecstasy
Right,
I
yes.
never dreamed possible. I know,
Right.
but if my clothes were strewn all over and getting wrinkled,
Yes.
I'm not going to be capable of ecstasy.
Marlis, I want to give up everything for you. Listen to me. Just listen to me. I want to throw it all away. My career, my retirement fund, and just go with you to Rome in a delirium of ecstasy. And what? All you can think of is keeping your clothes neat? Marlis?
Well, how about this? What if before you rip the clothes off of me, I say change into my old clothes?
Why can't you let go? And live, Marlis, live. Life is short. We've got to seize it. Well, I want to take you to the heights of ecstasy, Marlis.
I know, and I appreciate the thought. I really do. But what about my cats?
Your cats?
Well, I'm not going to roam without my cats.
I want to take you to the heights of ecstasy, and you're thinking about bringing pets, huh?
You know, why couldn't we, instead of Rome, just go to Granite Falls?
What? Marlis, there are no heights of ecstasy in Granite Falls. People don't rip their clothes off there.
How do you know that? Have you ever tried?
So I offer you Rome, and you want Granite Falls instead?
Well, why not just give it a try?
Oh!
The Secret Life of Lutherans was brought to you by Federated Fuel Oil Dealers of Western Minnesota. Instead of ecstasy, how about warmth?
It is funny, actually, but I guess you have to understand Lutherans to understand the heights of ecstasy in humor. That you could tell the audience was experiencing ecstasy as they were listening to that because they snickered a few times. So that's kind of how Lutherans react to humor. Did you ever see the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding? No. Oh, well, I won't bring that up. But because the male character in that marries the Greek woman, the Greek family is like just massive, Greek, all sorts of Greek kinds of characteristics. But the male's family, he's the sole child, and they're just very Lutheran. So it's kind of a hilarious movie because of the juxtaposition of two very, very different cultures. In his literature that he writes, and by the way, he was not thought of as a philosopher by the analytic tradition, of course, the British, the Americans. Existentialism was not really appreciated in that tradition at all. They surrounded themselves with language analysis, trying to figure out how to make language extremely clear, scientific, right? Rid it of ambiguity, so that you would know exactly when sentences were true and what they were false, etc. Right?
It's like something I mentioned before, but
yeah. I think Orwell was kind of making fun of that, actually. That one was the Orwell one, right? Because there's Gattaca is another one, and then there was Animal Farm. Well, Animal Farm was also Orwell, but yeah, kind of those criticisms of future utopic visions, where we might be going. The latest, by the way, is The Circle. If you've read The Circle or watched the movie, it strikes me as pretty darn close to where we're heading at the moment.
what's
The Circle? The Circle is a movie with Tom Hanks.
This is Gel Cinema technology. Uninterrupted streaming, brilliant sound clarity, and lifelike color. Experience Gel Cinema on the XPS 13, the laptop for people who watch things on their laptop.
Considering the plot of The Circle.
Do you think you behave better or worse when you are being watched? I am a believer in the perfectibility of human beings. At The Circle, we can finally realize our potential. When we are our best selves, there isn't a problem that we cannot solve. We can cure any disease, and we can end hunger. Imagine the human rights implications. The possibilities are endless.
Your payment. It was for $78.13 and the bill was for $78.31. Thank you.
You got the job at the Circle.
Have a drink, have a good time, and stay excited. You're at the Circle.
Hello, May. How are you?
Jared here. We're doing your training.
When I first started, it took me a few weeks to really get the hang of it. Believe me, you're doing fine.
You should come visit me at work sometime.
You might think I was there to clean the toilets.
Everyone really likes you.
Your work's been exemplary, strong ratings, but your absence at several events.
Sorry, my dad had an episode and I was home helping out.
Is that related to his MS?
I've been looking into your parents' situation, and I have an idea. I was thinking it would make sense for May's folks to come on the Circle Health Plan.
I want to say how much I value what you've done for my family.
May, you're a valued part of the Circle. We care about everybody you care about. May's only been with us for a few months, but she has made quite an impression. So, May, do you think you behave better or worse when you are being watched? We have cameras in place all over the world right now.
We used to go on adventures, we used to have fun and see things, and now it's all filtered through this. Does this really seem okay to you?
I didn't create this. This is not what I had in mind. Things at the Circle, they need to change. Everything recorded, seen, broadcast is stored and analyzed here. They can use it however they see fit, no matter what it's cost.
Knowing is good, but knowing everything is better. So, May, is there anything you want to tell us?
So I highly recommend it. I think it's a very, by the way, our very last meeting, we can watch a movie. I don't know, you guys get to vote on what movie. The people that come, because it's not a requirement for you to come to our last meeting. I'll be here. But whoever does come will get to vote on what movies I have. I usually like to stick a couple out on the table and you get to vote.
I did know that ISMD has been found to stick surveillance cameras and streetlights recently.
But we have a couple hundred here in Anchorage. You could go online and like for today, if you want to check the road conditions on the Glen, they have one right there by the way station and a couple other places, especially as you get, there's a camera from the Sheraton, there's a camera looking over the old movie theater, but I'm sure there are plenty of others. You go on the webpage and there's like 50 or so. So you can even look at ski conditions and all sorts of things. And what I've also been noticing, because I'm on the Eagle River Crime Facebook page, that people are posting all sorts of things, individuals that like approach their houses. Have you seen? You know, so a lot of folks in town the cameras are incredibly cheap, and you were in charge of the recording, so it's not like you're having to pay to some sort of agency to monitor your house. You can do all that yourself. Some of them you can monitor with your smartphone. So like if you're downtown at an event, you'll be notified if anyone's creeping around your house, and you could actually watch them or even talk to them with some of the cameras. As they come to the door, you could ask them what's up, which might be enough to answer their question if they're legitimate, or chase them away if they're not, you know. So the basic thesis behind this movie is philosophically presenting us with the question is, are we interested in having total transparency? In other words, everything that happens is, you know, something there that's open for the public to watch, so there's no more privacy. Or are there limits to that, you know? And so there's good aspects of it, there's bad aspects of it, and that movie kind of explores both in a way that I think doesn't answer the question, poses the question. And considering, I think it's becoming every day a more more and more live question for us about how much privacy. I've got my camera rolling right now, right? You know, it's well, rolling is totally a wrong metaphor since there's no movement in that camera. I don't know how it works, but when I like bring the camera and I have it on and an old person says, "Are you filming me?" And I'll say, "Well, there's no film in this camera." And they go, "Oh, okay." It's not an outright lie. It certainly misleads them. You know, I think they get the impression, well, if there's no film, you're not filming. Then, you know, well, no, I'm not. It's not filming. There's no film. What can I say? I used to take pictures Wednesday nights at my group, but a couple of them said, "Stop it." So that was the end of that. I don't bring the camera to that anymore. However, but that was, why not record everything that happens? Of course, this doesn't really have much to do with existentialism and Kierkegaard, I don't think. I'm not sure. But our analytic tradition didn't think of continental philosophy as really philosophy for a while. It wasn't from what they were thinking, but that went away. I mean, we didn't do away with that. That analytic tradition is actually absolutely very strong, very important, and merged into computer technologies and all sorts of other important things. So it was a very important tradition, and it was very important that they did all that work. But when we look at philosophy in the big picture, they had narrowed the focus down to the point where they weren't really dealing with the big questions, meaning in life, and all that sort of thing. The Europeans kept that up, and existentialism was essentially the tradition that did that for us. Kierkegaard was definitely one. He's in that generation of young people that's responding to Hegel's philosophy, where Hegel gives us this view that we can actually understand everything that's going on to the extent that it's part of the phenomena we're aware of, because our concepts are part of our phenomena. So we don't have the Kantian division between the thing in itself and the way things appear to us. Instead, the way things appear to us is the thing in itself. Right, so study phenomenology, right? Studying the phenomena as it appears to us becomes a way of trying to get a sense of what's out there. And Bruno Latour, with his contemporary attempt to study all the different language games that are out there and see how they compete with one another, is of course looking at the entire world picture in all of its various, interactive models that we use. So that's where the things have gone in that sense. But at the point where Kierkegaard is a young man, he graduates from his philosophy program in Copenhagen and then goes to Berlin to study in graduate school. And while he's there, he studies Friedrich Schelling's teaching about his roommate's, Hegel's, philosophy. How's this happen? Well, Friedrich Schelling was a slightly younger man than Hegel. In fact, he was one of 3 roommates. Hegel was the other, and Herderlein was the other. So the 3 of them in Tübingen University at the time must have been absolutely amazing, considering all 3 of them would become famous. Herderlein would be considered by many to be Germany's greatest poet. Goethe also, so depends on right, it's subjective, who do you like. Herderlein was also considered crazy, but lived quite long, despite that. Hegel, of course, is famous as perhaps one of the greatest German philosophers, although I think Leibniz is usually considered the greatest of them all. It's kind of interesting, but for good reason. Leibniz was just absolutely amazing. Hegel was kind of a normal person that just studied a lot. Does that make sense? Leibniz, probably autistic, nobody liked him, spoke all sorts of languages, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, French, German, English, and when he wrote to people, he would quote people in whatever language they spoke. So his letters and things are very difficult to translate unless you speak all the languages he uses in the letters. You can imagine, right? Or they'll slip into Greek and Latin, and back to Greek, then French, and so, whoa. But Leibniz, by the way, also invented binary code. Along with Sir Isaac Newton, they invented calculus separately. So Sir Isaac Newton invented calculus over a space of about 20 plus years. Didn't really publish it. Leibniz figured it out in a different way and published it much sooner, which infuriated Sir Isaac Newton. That gets you into what was called the calculus wars. I don't know if you're interested in that. Leibniz invented also a calculating machine that did logarithms, and it eventually became the property of a small startup company called International Business Machines, and began to produce a machine based on that model, which made them a very productive company. And eventually, of course, you're familiar with Big Blue, right? IBM, and it became a big company, etc. He also came up with the theory, this is Leibniz, he also came up with the concept of monads. And monads are the Latin version of atom, right? So, because they're ones. And he referred to them as spiritual beings, which, by the way, if you update the vocabulary, I would argue that means energy, which, of course, is exactly what we think today. So essentially, his concept of the monad, physicists consider to be a precursor to the concept of quarks, etc. So he's considering, see, he's dies in 1716, so that's way before any of that those developed. His theory about the nature of the cosmos was also a relativity as opposed to a stationary, static universe, which was Sir Isaac Asimov's view. So they were in conflict over that. So there were a lot of things that the two of them kind of were in conflict over. But I just mentioned him because he's considered by many Germans to be the greatest German philosopher, perhaps the greatest genius of all time, as far as people are concerned. Remember I mentioned that Hypatia is considered by some to be the greatest female genius that ever lived. I don't know how you would find out how the heck that would be the case. But Schelling was the first of the three roommates in Tübingen that ended up becoming famous as a philosopher and teaching. And he's in fact the one who got his roommate friend Hegel his first teaching job at the University of Vienna, which was kind of as an adjunct position. Up until that point, Hegel had been basically a tutor in houses, wealthy persons' houses, basically, and a live-in tutor for their children after he graduated from Tübingen. Schelling and Hegel had a falling out when Hegel finally published his first major book, The Phenomenology. He described Schelling's philosophy as a precursor to his own in the Phenomenology, and of course Schelling was furious over that, and so that kind of broke them up as friends. They stayed in touch, they even actually visited, but they were not on friendly terms because of that. Hegel kind of apologized, but it was never very convincing, right? In any case, Hegel died in 1831, probably of a stomach ulcer, although there was also the plague in town at the time, in Berlin, where he was the head of the university, which was really like the flagship of the educational system in Germany, which was becoming closer to a unified German state. Not quite yet. But Hegel, in fact, wrote a constitution for the German state, which never actually was used or anything. But when Hegel died, he was 62. The chair was vacant for a few years till they decided who they wanted to put in place of Hegel, and they used Schelling. So Schelling ended up coming to Berlin, keeping in mind this kind of dispute between them. When Schelling then began teaching what Hegel's philosophy was, he taught it as a precursor to his own philosophy, which he referred to as Existenz philosophy, which sounds an awful lot like existentialism to me, philosophy of existence. So why he's not considered the founder of existentialism, I don't know, but Kierkegaard is. Kierkegaard's considered the founder of existentialism. What's interesting about the class, though, is that Kierkegaard's sitting there in the class listening to Schelling's presentation on Hegel and his own philosophy, and sitting somewhere else in the auditorium, there was probably about 200 students, was Karl Marx. So you've got Karl Marx and Kierkegaard together studying Hegel from Schelling, who we would certainly be convinced today he was wrong about his interpretation of Hegel, that he misunderstood it somehow. It's very complex. But in any case, you get the impression that both Kierkegaard and Marx rebel against Hegel's philosophy because of the impression they got of his philosophy from Schelling. So I could just imagine the teacher not liking Hegel, teaching Hegel in such a way that everybody in his class wants to rebel against Hegel. But what was odd is that Kierkegaard rebels against Hegel by arguing that he's wrong in thinking that our peers and the spirit of the times, the spirit of our community, the spirit of your family are having such an intense control over who you become. And instead, he argues that we are totally free to decide for ourselves. Right? Marx, by the way, is absolutely into that, but totally against Hegel's view that we are free agents despite all of that. So the two of them rebel for totally opposite points of view. That's pretty fascinating to me. And of course, Karl Marx goes on then to create a philosophy that's referred to as communism, the idea that all we have to realize is that your peers and your society basically teach you what you like, teach you what you want, and so all we have to do is create the right propaganda to control everybody so that they behave in a utopic state, which will be a communist state. And by the way, of course, retrospectively, way ahead of Marx's time, we know that those places that tried to put that into practice absolutely resulted in dismal failures. So communism is completely out right now. Although, of course, people like Zizek, who remain communist, not wanting communism to actually take foot again, but in the sense that he'll use Marx's critiques of capitalism, which he says are still very apropos, and very much in the way that Latour is actually heading as far as the beginning of that lecture that I showed, that capitalism is certainly problematic in a lot of ways, as you can see, of course, in our own situation. Okay, so Kierkegaard's focus is, I think, recognizing as young people that you come to understand this philosophy that Hegel's given us, that these philosophies, these different models, if you will, of the way life is, religions give us a different point of view, and they're in competition with one another, but they're also created by man through this dialectical process, where you're taught a point of view. As you grow up and you experience things, you learn things, you end up affecting that point of view. So you can engage that, especially in a small community like here. You can go and volunteer and affect people by your point of view. And so you can change that model, and then it becomes that model that then influences other people. So there's a dialectical process between how the model appears objective to you, but you grow up and your subjective point of view interacts with that objective model and changes it, and then that becomes a new objective model for everyone else, etc. So there's a constant dialectical, very complex process that sociology studies, by the way. That's what sociology does, is try to understand these people in groups and how they're influential, how they, and we've got all sorts of fascinating tools in sociology that help us. One of the people I find really Russell, what's his name? I'm misspelling all these words, but hopefully. I think I might have even shown you this. Oh, it's not Russell. Randall Collins. The Sociology of Philosophies gives us interactive rituals. So let's see if I want to. Too shallow. Won't go. All right. So a general theory of interaction rituals, just the way we say hello, or the way you come into a classroom. All these different patterns are interaction rituals, right? So the level of study in sociology is really quite micro. You can imagine how specialized they get in specific things. And by the way, that also applies to the language we use. You can literally map out the various linguistic bits and try to figure out how they all interact, fit in, etc. So if you think of it, this kind of follows that whole growth and how our understanding of ourselves is exploded from this point of view on. But Kierkegaard is at the point where he sees the power, and he's persuaded by Hegel's point of view, and yet at the same time faced with this question, okay, well, if all of these models that are in competition with one another, Christian, Lutheran, Catholic, are all arguing with one another, and none of them are true in the scientific sense, right? But we need them. You have to have them. And once you realize that Hegel's right about this, and these are all models that are in competition with one another, you are now faced with the question about you're choosing which model to believe. That's why it's existentialism. The main point of it is that I exist, I'm here, and I'm the one that's responsible for picking what I believe. I have to do it. I'm a free agent. I'm not going to simply be dominated by what they tell me. I'm not going to just listen to the priest and go, oh, you're right. Whoa, whoa, whoa. That certainly happens to us when we're kids. We don't have any other choice. But guess what? By the time you're at this age, now you're at the point where you've got teachers telling you that, aha, all those people have been misleading you. They're using you. Don't be used. You know, don't go out there and buy a hamburger just because you saw a beautiful hamburger on TV, you know, from Burger King. You know, you don't, you know, you feel hungry because they have this sizzling, beautiful hamburger. You know, I've got to go get one. Well, they're manipulating you, and you know it. So you're like, aha, I'm not going to be, you know, forced to go out and buy a Burger King hamburger, especially because Burger King is so far away. I'll go to McDonald's instead. You're in charge of yourself. You don't have to go do what people say. You know, they tell you you should be a patriot. Well, it's up to you to be a patriot. You know, you should be a communist. Whoa, do I want to be a communist? You know, that would, you know, just irritate the hell out of everybody else, right? You know, do I want to do that? Maybe I will, you know. Do I want to dress like, you know, I'm wearing jeans that are about ready to fall off? Wow, that seems to be the mode. Everyone, wow, if you want to be cool, you have to, well, you would be cool if you're running around outside with jeans that are full of holes, I suppose. Let's have a few bolts in my head, you know. Wow, I want to look unique, you know. I'll put all sorts of fascinating tattoos all over my head. I'll make myself look dead or scary or something, you know. Why? Why do people do that? Well, because they want to fit in, maybe, or fit out. Right? You know. So what motivates a person to do that? Literally, if you think of it, was it their own free agency, or were they motivated by wanting to fit in by the mob? Hey, why don't you go and jump off a cliff? You know, all of us other, what are the little animals that are famous for jumping off of cliffs?
Sheep, penguins.
No, there's a particular animal that famously they'll all just walk right off the cliff together. No?
Sheep?
No. Not sheep. There's little animals that do that.
I've heard that is actually false, and
yeah,
they did
I'm
it
sure.
on a video to try and make good
and
footage.
They won't. Yeah, I understand.
Lemmings.
Lemmings. Famous. I don't know. But that's dumb. But you get the idea. To some extent, we do want to fit in. On the other hand, you are a free agent. That's very confusing, right? And different individuals will want to be more individual, and others will want to be more part of a group, right? You know, so you can almost tell. I deliberately try to wear clothing that makes me sort of like C.S. Lewis, but I refuse to go with the pipe. You know, that's just not me. Plus, I prefer the beard. I know he must have gotten up and shaved every damn day, you know. Because there's no pictures of him with a beard or even with a stubble. He's always clean shaven. That strikes me as, well, he didn't live in Alaska. You know, that's for sure. However, so yeah, I try to fit in to a certain extent. I won't use certain vocabulary in class unless I feel like you guys find it acceptable. In fact, if you guys expect it as like something unique, well, I'll try to make sure I use it then, you know, so I fit in. Whoa, you know, because I'm trying to be liked, right? At the same time, I am trying to influence you, obviously, right? You know, so if you think how complex this all is. But for Kierkegaard, it was incredibly depressing because he felt like there was absolutely no grounds for believing one narrative over another one. They were all unbelievable. And so, at the same time, knowing that you have to believe in something, or you don't have any values, you don't have any reason for getting up, whoa, we've talked about this, right? You know, so what ought we to do? And he argues we have to take a leap of faith on a night of fear and trembling. Those are actually two different articles that he wrote. Fear and Trembling. It's actually a book. Kierkegaard. By the way, as far as I know, his works are all still copyright, and that's not because he's relatively recent at all, of course. See that he's back in the 19th century as a writer, right? But it's because all of his works were in Danish, of course, and by the time they got translated into English, the copyright is still there, as far as I know. So we're not going to see his works, as far as I know. Wow, I guess you could. So here's Fried Bob. I don't know how you would say it. But do we get to see any chance of it being? So that's the book. Spark Notes. You get. That's kind of interesting. Overall summary, etc. So Fear and Trembling, that's his expression of, is it a biblical quote, Fear and Trembling? Could be, but I mean, he was a field. By the way, his studies in Copenhagen were to prepare him to be a Lutheran minister. And he kept going back to that, planning on becoming a Lutheran minister. He was also engaged to marry a young woman. The odd thing about that, and he wrote a book. What is that? That's an advertisement. It has nothing to do with Fear and Trembling, I don't think. But the Diary of the Seducer. So Regine Olsen was the woman that he was in love with and proposed, and she agreed to marry him. And then 2 weeks before the wedding, he canceled it. And within a couple of years, she became engaged to another guy, married him. By the way, he left for the United States, so that's interesting. But he was furious with her because he thought, how could you have really been in love with me if you've gone and become engaged to this other guy? He's not obviously into the practical consequences of his saying no 2 weeks before the wedding. But in the Diary of a Seducer, he gives us a fictional account of a young man that decides he's going to persuade a young woman to elope with him, just to see if he could do it, not because he really wanted her to marry him. And so he goes through this various stages. At the time I read it, I remember thinking, I was trying to get young women to marry me. Just one. But, they're out there, you want to find, right? So I took kind of an interest in how do you proceed, to get their interest. And he, just gradually gets them more and more interested in him until he eventually gets her to the point where she takes the cab that comes in the middle of the night to pick her up, a horse and buggy kind of cab, takes her to the park where he's supposed to meet with her, and the two of them will go off and elope. And she comes out with her luggage, gets into the cab drives off to the rendezvous in the park and waits for him, and he never shows up. I was like, furious with it. How could he do that to her? Never even went and told her, nah, it's off. Nothing. Just left her sitting there. Can you imagine? What an asshole. Really. Which is a word you guys have taught me that I could use in
So is that why he cut off the wedding? Do we know exactly why?
No. But, you know, he wrote that story, and yet this is so closely parallel to something that actually happens in his life. It makes, is it autobiographical? Is that why that happened? But no, we don't know for sure. There are some folks that argue that the reason he didn't marry her was because he had already come to understand the misery he was going to have in his life because of his bipolar. I mean, he didn't know what it was. He realized he had these frequent bouts of depression, and he didn't want to put her through that. So that's a nice way of looking at it and saying that he didn't want to make her suffer by having to live with a guy that had those kinds of bouts of depression. But who knows? Who knows? So, and notice this is a literature. His literature is another aspect of his literature writing was that he had two pseudonyms, right, fake names that he used. He published articles under, and the two of them argued with one another. So this guy, you know, the 1 week, you know, or 1 day, whatever, every couple of days, he would have an article in the paper, right, as this, you know, guy, right, and then everyone would read it and love the argument, you know, and then the next, you know, paper would come out with an article from the other guy arguing with that one, and this went on, you know, and everyone was like, you know, taking sides with these, you know, wondering what the, you know, the other guy was going to say. But all along it was just Kierkegaard writing both sides and just stringing people along. But by the way, he didn't make any money, as far as I understood, doing this. He did have some money. His father, when his father died, left him an inheritance. And the day that he took the last money out of the bank, he collapsed in the street and died a couple days later. So, that's kind of sad too, because he was only 42. But so when he says, you know, that on the night of fear and trembling, we have to take that leap of faith and believe something, he chooses Christianity. But it doesn't persuade me. His depressed life and his early death strike me as indicating that he didn't fully persuade himself to take that leap of faith. And one of the articles he writes about is compares the various stages on life's way. These stages take place after you've already studied philosophy and you've accepted Hegel's explanation of things, and so you're the one now that has to choose a meaning for yourself. And he says the first stage that people typically choose is the stage of the aesthetic life, which is just have fun. If that's all there is, my friend, just roll out the booze and have a ball, right, basically. Right? And, you know, maybe extreme sports, things like that, you know, just trying to make your life an absolute blast, you know, might be your reaction to feeling like there's no real meaning in life, but I can have a ball, I can have fun. The trouble is that gradually wears thin. Maybe as you get older, you feel sore, you can't do extreme sports anymore. I also like to think you also might meet a young woman or a young man, and you get married and you have children, and now you've got children to take care of. And you begin feeling a social obligation. And so you can't just keep having fun. Instead, you've got to become serious now. And so the next stage, he says, is the stage of the ethical life. He calls this the ethical life, and that's the stage where you basically accept the ethics of your community and begin acting like you believe it. So you act like you believe the meta-narrative of the values of the community. So in other words, you try to fit in, you believe what everybody around you basically already believes, and you act on that. The trouble is, of course, you don't really believe it. And so if you end up in a situation where you're basically having to risk your life for that set of values, you're not really ready to to do that, right? And the example he uses in his literature of this is Agamemnon's situation, where he's the king of the Greeks, and he's trying to lead them against Troy. The winds are against them, and the gods, the priests, say that he has to sacrifice Iphigenia in order to change the winds. And remember, we've talked about Iphigenia before, yes? Yes? No? Maybe so? But in any case, he ends up sacrificing. Not because he really believes it, but because his men demand it. But the third and last one is the life of faith. And his example there is Abraham. And Abraham, of course, in his situation, is told to sacrifice his only son. But Abraham really believes it. He really believes it. So for Kierkegaard, you really have to believe. How do you do that? How do you find something you really believe? Good quiz question, maybe? What meta-narrative do you really believe? What meta-narrative gives you a sense of meaning in life? Is that a fair question? Mine, by the way, is that our job on earth, we've taken upon ourselves to learn as much as we can. And so learning as much as we can and encouraging others seems to be my goal in life. Does that make sense? Or wasn't it originally, of course. But in college, when I got to that point where Kierkegaard literally drove me bonkers because I thought I had the same problem, the solution that occurred to me was really offered by Hegel, and that was the idea of progress. That there's progress in our spirit. Our spirit is connected to the Spirit of God. So basically what the Spirit of God in man is the spirit of coming to know as much as we can. So that, by the way, merged beautifully with my Roman Catholic upbringing. Too much fun? Questions? We forgot to do term paper questions.
What does existentialism have to do with postmodernism today?
Well, if you look at the history of European thinking, they of course don't just sit. In a sense, I would say postmodernism is existentialism. But postmodernism, one of the main authors I think of is Jean-Francois Lyotard, in his book, Postmodernism, argues that all of these meta-narratives, these grand narratives, he calls them, are false. So that places you in the, so it's a modern version of existentialism. All these modern meta-narratives are false, and so we have no meaning in life, and that's what causes the postmodern crisis, is that people grow up and have no purpose in life. So they're living a life that's basically one with no divine leadership or anything. Instead, everybody is just doing whatever the heck they feel like, and that creates a crisis. So in a sense, I think of postmodernism as the contemporary, situation in existentialist thinking.
It seems like nihilism is quite tied to existentialism as well.
Right. You can see that. Nietzscheism is another interesting aspect of it, because we could certainly interpret Nietzsche as